Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session. My name is AHMED BENRAOUANE. I'm advising Dubai government on innovation and AI, and it's an honor for me to be with you in this summit. It's a great summit because we will be engaged in some conversation that hopefully will allow us to understand where we are in terms of regulatory environment, but more importantly, what are the challenges, the risk, and the technicalities that sometimes we tended to forget as regulators, but more importantly, are quite important for experts. I was looking at some data a couple of days ago, and I read that a survey conducted by Fidelity Digital Assets in the US found out that about 60% of investors are reluctant to invest specifically because a lack of regulatory clarity. People don't know what it is and what is not. And if you have been tuned in the news, even if you have not been tuned in the news, probably you have heard about many failures, many bankruptcies in this space. So it is important for us to address this issue of regulatory environment. Another survey I looked at recently by the ECB, the European Central Bank, found that about 48% of people want some sort of regulation at the European level, while about 24 people looking at regulation at the national level. That's about 80% of people or investors wanting to see some sort of regulation. So, what is the state of regulation at the global levels? What are the challenges? What are the risks? How can we create a regulatory environment that does not stifle innovation, but at the same time does not create an environment for fraud and provide some sort of protection? But before that, let me just briefly say why we are here today in Dubai. We are here in Dubai because of the vision of the senior political leadership, and specifically His Highness Sheikh Mohammed, to make of Dubai the new future city and the new hub for emerging technologies. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed always reminds us that if you don't build your future, if you don't design your future, someone else will design it for you. And we want to design our own future. We want to design it, of course, for the rest of the people. That's why Dubai, in recent years, with the help of Trustcon and many other investors, has emerged as a central hub for innovation, blockchain, Web3, and many other technologies. So thank you for being here. And my first question to my panel, maybe I will start with SAQR. If you could just give us an update on where we are in terms of regulation, in terms of regions, but also in terms of what's happening in that space.
Well, first of all, it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you. It's a full house, and you know, it's absolutely fascinating because the first time we were speaking about this in the UAE, we could hardly get 5 to 10 people together to talk about blockchain. Now, we believe that the UAE will be at the heart of this future revolution that is blockchain, Web3, crypto, NFTs, call it what you may. And that is due to 3 core elements. We believe that the UAE has come together to create a perfect amalgamation of 3 elements, right? It is the infrastructure that we're all consuming over here, but not just the physical infrastructure, but also the regulatory infrastructure, and last but not least, the digital infrastructure. It is the capital that's always been here in the UAE, and I'm very happy that also the DIFC is present with us today, who have recorded more hedge funds last year than ever before. Right? And also, more millionaires have moved to the UAE than ever before, right? But probably what is the most unique element in the UAE, one element that you can't find anywhere. You can find great infrastructure, you can find great talent, you can find great capital. It is talent. Talented individuals, looking at this room right now, or looking at this panel, right? Looking in the room, without even exaggerating, I'm looking at 30 different nationalities. Talented individuals from all around the world are flocking to the UAE. Now, all of this is what is appearing to be just a perfect storm of coincidences is not. The The basics of this were set as early as 2014 and 15 when Dubai announced a Dubai blockchain strategy. This was later followed on with an Emirates blockchain strategy, later followed on by His Highness announcing the Dubai Metaverse strategy. With that, and with the fact that ADGM as early as 2018 was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to start regulating crypto exchanges. Bahrain became one of the first central banks to regulate crypto exchanges in the world and specifically in the region. It is important to note that we, as the UAE, are now appearing on global indices of regulatory leadership. Right? In the UAE, you are welcome if you are working in the digital asset space. Who are other notable countries to talk about? Another hotspot in the world is Switzerland. Switzerland today houses around 1,200 startups, but this is far exceeded by the UAE, where we're counting today 1,650 startups, making it the largest blockchain ecosystem in the world, which is why we're calling it the crypto oasis. Now, mind you, regulation is something that in any technology, let alone an emerging technology and a nascent technology like crypto and blockchain, is always going to hinge behind. But what the UAE is doing is it's establishing itself as a leader by adopting this uncertainty and saying, hey, we will work with the private sector, with entities like us, to define the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, SAQR, for putting all these moving pieces together to point out to the coherent framework that the UAE has been working on to offer, again, the safety nets, but more importantly, the security that investors are looking for. Jason, some of the most important rules of engagement that you believe are critical to building a nascent technology, what would be these, some of the rules?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of the rules, right? I am ostensibly here as the chief legal officer of a crypto company. Perhaps you're under the mistaken impression that I know something about crypto law and regulation, right? But I have young folks come to me all the time. They want to be in the industry. They want to be attorneys who are crypto attorneys, right? And I have to tell them, unfortunately, that there is no such thing, right? Because there is no crypto law today. There is no digital asset law, with a few global exceptions and with some things that are coming online soon. But when I joined Fireblocks, we had a very simple thesis, and we carried that thesis through today. We focus on institutional customers, corporate customers. So if you want to have corporate customers enter the space, adopt digital asset technologies, you have to have clear rules of engagement. And we at Fireblocks have been focusing on our efforts working with major jurisdictions like Dubai, important jurisdictions like Dubai, to create those clear rules of engagement. I think if you look at successful capital markets, the ones that have really dominated the world stage for the last 50 or 60 years, right? They have entrepreneurs, they have capital. A lot of places have those things. But they also are characterized by the rule of law and predictable legal outcomes. If we're gonna have massive digital asset adoption in the institutional space, we need those things. So just to create some stakes around this conversation, right? We're not just talking about rules for the sake of rules. We're not, talking about law for the sake of law. We are talking about creating the conditions for the next major industry in the world. And so regulation is hugely important in this space and a good topic.
Very good, Jason. Thank you so much for actually bringing up the notion of institutional investment. Most of us as entrepreneurs and free thinkers, we tended to see investment only at the level of individuals, but you will not be able to mature the industry, will not be able to push that industry to an acceptance unless you have those big players, the corporate investment engaged. So thanks for bringing this up. ERWIN, welcome. This is your first visit from Europe to Dubai, so I want to specifically welcome you. I hope you're going to enjoy your stay. You come from the European Blockchain Association. Could you give us an overview on what's going on? What's the debate? What's the conversation in Europe in terms of regulations? And if you're able to tell us also a little bit about what's going on in the Asia front and also in the US front.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me, and indeed it is my first time in Dubai, and I hope for many more happy returns. Europe made the decision in 2014-15 to prioritize blockchain as one of the, let's say, emerging frontier technologies, and this was an official commission strategy. And this has sort of percolated and matured into what slowly then became the proposal for the Markets and Crypto Assets Regulation, which is Europe's landmark legislation on crypto assets, crypto asset service providers, asset reference tokens, stablecoins, and essentially it's not, you shouldn't think of MiCA as one regulation. It's actually three separate main regimes. So it's the issuance and sale of non-stable coins to exchanges and to customers. It's the issuance and sale of stable coins and e-money tokens to exchanges and customers. And then it's a special licensing regime for crypto asset service providers. Now, what MiCA is part of the broader digital finance package. It also has the DLT pilot regime, which enters into force on March 23rd, actually, so very, very soon. And what the DLT pilot regime does is essentially establishes a bespoke regime for central securities depositories and for multilateral trading facilities to issue DLT market infrastructures, DLT settlement systems, and DLT trading and settlement systems, and it gives them up to a 6-year exemption from the Markets in Financial Instruments Regulation, Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, and also the CSDR, and essentially allows them to dabble and experiment with DLT market infrastructures without having to worry about whether or not the assets that are traded on these platforms will contravene those existing regulations. Aside from that, we also have the Digital Operation Resilience Act, so DORA, which establishes an ICT risk management framework for third-party ICT risk management. And then we have, what's interestingly enough in MiCA is, I'd say more than what's put in it is what's not mentioned, and that is fully decentralized finance, although the scope of what constitutes fully decentralized finance is not quite elucidated. And then also staking as a service, so liquid staking and receipt tokens are not, for me, and NFTs are the things that are omitted and are quite fascinating, because this is, at the European Blockchain Association, what we recognize is that decentralized finance is the next shoe to drop. So if you're looking at the biggest challenges with DeFi, for example, number one, it's that there is not a native Web3 primitive identity standard that you can use to overcome information asymmetries in decentralized markets, right? So, for example, last year, Vitalik Buterin and some co-authors proposed the introduction of a concept known as soulbound tokens, which some of you may be familiar with. Soulbound tokens are fascinating because they allow you to code social provenance on-chain, right? So, for example, it gives you the chance to identify your counterparty, move towards what could be known as a form of embedded supervision, but I always couch that in saying you should walk before you run. And aside from that, we also have an environment in Europe that, as you've already mentioned, has focalized crypto clusters, like Crypto Valley in Zug was one of the largest, but we should also mention Liechtenstein, because the TVTG, the Blockchain Act, is probably one of the most forward-looking regulations on digital assets anywhere in the world. And I always liken it to an example of Schrodinger's cat, but it's Schrodinger's token, right? So it's based on you don't regulate the thing until you peer under the hood and you see what it is, and then you adopt the regulatory regime rather than, let's say, a reflective ex-ante regulation. Unfortunately, what I see going on in the States, and I'm sure Jason would agree, is the regulation by enforcement as de facto carpet bombing the industry. And whether or not you buy the argument that all crypto assets are securities or all crypto assets are not securities, I think that a lack of clarity also makes it extremely difficult for companies to operate in the space. And if you buy the presumption that all crypto assets fit under this box or that box, and then you choose to regulate with the heel instead of with the hand, then you're also creating, by definition, conflictual situations. Now, what we should also talk about is regulation around what isn't crypto, but will at least ring-fence crypto on the perimeters, and that's CBDCs. I know there's going to be a panel on CBDCs later, but it's interesting to mention what's going on in the BIS Innovation Hub, which is also working with the Central Bank of Dubai, Monetary Authority of Singapore, Hong Kong Monetary Authority, People's Bank of China. There's different projects out there like Intanon Lion Rock, the mBridge Initiative, Project Icebreaker, for example. And then I would also say we should mention SWIFT, because SWIFT had a CBDC pilot last year on connecting digital islands that they've transferred into an actual working prototype, right, where they can connect domestic CBDC systems to communicate with each other, do off-chain Forex, experimenting the integration of Nostro Vostro accounts into these things, and based on an intercommunication system that's based on ISO 222 that can use Swift's messaging hub as the de facto standard, connecting that as the hub, and then all the little CBDC central bank outlets as the spokes. So we're creating a situation globally where we're going to have fragmented digital currency areas, and make no mistake, crypto is political by definition. If you look at what's baked into the Genesis block, right, it's chancellors on the brink of second bailout to banks. So from the very first instance of the first block of the Bitcoin blockchain, crypto was political. And if you don't have that as your ontological starting point, you're approaching the space regulatorily from a different perspective. And I think that's also something in the community that we should be more aware of, is that we are by and large engaging in political design.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erwin, for bringing this, and more importantly, for linking this conversation, this very vertical conversation we're having with other stuff, mainly the CDBC that you talked about. Again, the entire ecosystem has to be synchronized. I think there is a conundrum for regulation, and if you are a regulator, you probably are grappling with this issue. How can I create, again, a regulation, a smart regulation that allows, again, for more innovation, for more engagement, for more progress, for more emergence of technologies and new product? But at the same time, how can I make sure that this regulation, again, protects investors and consumers? Everybody actually is going to want to have some sort of regulations, but when regulation is mature, then everybody starts to say, well, we don't want to have that regulation. I spent a lot of time studying the US experience, and I was reading recently a study with respect to AI, not to the blockchain, but again, it's something that we can learn from. About 94% of business leaders, of CEOs, they want some sort of regulation now of the AI space. That's something a little bit surprising to me, honestly, to see that business leaders wanting to see this type of regulation. Because again, this conundrum of regulation, how can I bring regulation to protect, again, the interest of the investors and the consumers, but at the same time, it allows for the emergence of technology. So SAQR, my question to you, you have spent a lot of time in the region and traveling around the world. What's your thought on balancing these two requirements? If you are a regulator, if you are a central banker, how would you deal with this issue?
Well, first of all, I'd realize that there's something that I've done really, really wrong, right? This couldn't be more relevant than right now. Silicon Valley Bank last weekend collapsed in itself. Today, more than 186 banks are at the brink of what Silicon Valley has gone through. Over the last night, ERWIN was funny enough to say, I entered into the plane, I came out of the plane, and with UBS and Credit Suisse being one organization. I think there's a very important notion that often is forgotten when we're talking about regulation. Regulation as we know it, governance and governments as we know them, follow principles that are, if they're modern, from the 19th and 20th century. The technologies we are dealing with, if it was AI or artificial intelligence or virtual reality or blockchain or NFTs or cloud computing, are technologies that are still emerging for all intents and purposes. Technologies that at the base change on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So we're trying to use these governance elements that are from the 19th century to try and adapt to these technologies that are changing and rapidly changing. With that, I want to put forward a very extreme notion. Democracy as we know it is not made to govern these technologies, because by the time the democracy cycle goes all the way through, the technology that you've started to regulate has already changed in a way that is not relevant to the regulation that you issue. With that, if regulation was the answer, then we wouldn't have had the 2008 crisis. If regulation was the answer, we wouldn't have had Bernie Madoff and one of the largest Ponzi schemes in the world. If regulation was the answer, then Silicon Valley Bank wouldn't have happened the way it did. With that, yes, regulation is required. Yes, it's very important for us to give consumers the confidence that we will define regulations of one sort or the other. Having said that, I think we need a completely fresh look at the way we do regulation. And the UAE, Dubai specifically, is a great example of that. Over there, the regulation was drafted in partnership with the private sector, in partnership with the ecosystem. Name one other regulator in the world that has put together working groups from the private sector and has actually implemented them in less than 6 months, right? So the notion to put out there is these technologies that we're dealing with are so fast changing that regulation, unfortunately, the way it's structured and designed today, is not made to keep up with the technology.
Yeah, this is wonderful, SAQR, that you are mentioning. I think that the key point is to identify the players who have an impact on the industry and work with them as government. And that's in itself is a new form of governance. So it's not something that's coming from, again, certain institutions or from a top-down approach, but actually it's a bottom-up, that is, you work with the people who have interest and stakes in this type of regulations and develop this in an agile and resilient way. So Jason, from your perspective, you have been practicing law for some time and compliance. What are some of the components that you needed to have to put together a framework that would be agile enough and reasonable enough to be accepted, at least as a beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. Just at the observational level, right? We are seeing 3 different frameworks, I think, developing globally, right? One is no framework, and I don't recommend it. The second is what I would call the model adopted by the European Union, adopted by FATF in some extent, and I would also argue with something like VARA here in Dubai. That model looks at a digital asset and says, okay, we're going to create a law with a defined term, and it's digital asset, right? And then we're going to go from there, and we're going to build out a new framework. This is, I think, a very good approach, right, and a good way of handling technological complexity and acknowledging it. The third approach is the approach that we're seeing in the United States today, and that's basically an approach of saying, okay, we have existing law and regulation on the books. In fact, we have a very developed legal system. Let's try to put the digital asset into one category or another of existing rule sets, right? And we're seeing the friction in the United States today with the SEC fighting with the CFTC, a kind of lack of leadership in Congress, and the situation has. You mentioned regulation by enforcement. I think the situation is far more dire than that, to be honest. In the United States, you mentioned SVB Bank. There are actually 3 bank failures in the United States: Silvergate, then SVB, and then Signature Bank.
Right.
What's, I think, not been widely reported, or the dots have not all been connected, is that there is reason to believe that this was targeted and coordinated action by the US government against banks that have ties to crypto companies, right? And so the situation is, I would say, deteriorating in the United States, and unfortunately, there may be contagion that spreads to the rest of the global financial system. One of the interesting things about all these models and the way they were being developed or adopted, right? The last time we had mass regulatory change in the global financial markets, right, was coming out of the 2008 crisis. What's interesting about that is that the G20 or whatever it was got together and they came up with a principled set of standards or rules for themselves, and they all took it back home and they implemented it in the form of MiFID, in the form of Dodd-Frank, et cetera, right? So we had a crisis which was a galvanizing moment. What we have right now are competing nationalities and spheres of influence, right? So we have some folks taking a really aggressive approach to regulation. I mean that actually in a good way. Like they're actively looking about how to regulate the space. How do we create adoption through law, right? And then we have jurisdictions like the United States. And if I could say something that pains me a little bit, but I think the message has to be unequivocal, right? This is a sort of arms race in the field of law and regulation, and the United States is, I would argue, others have the opportunity to take market share from the United States for the first time in a generation, I would say. So I think we're seeing the beginnings of a global repositioning. I think it's a really interesting time and really fascinating, and we'll see how it develops.
Wonderful. Erwin, I wanted to dig a little bit down with respect to the EU regulations.
Sure.
What are some of the most critical dimensions that will allow for this emerging industry, nascent industry, to move as it is without being choked? We all know that regulations in Europe tend to be relatively aggressive, and that's a statement I'm making. I may be wrong, I may be right. But I wanted to get your view as someone who's dealing with this on a daily basis. What is your reaction? What is your perception?
So I'm going to start with just piggybacking onto what Jason and SAQR had said, because I think it's important, and then I will get to the EU regulation part. When you're dealing with an emerging technology that is based on an entirely new governance model, it's always good to draw a corollary to see what the governance model that's underpinning our body politic currently today looks like, and then trying to apply that and seeing if that model also works, for example, in something as innovative and innovative as a DAO. Okay, and I use a DAO because a DAO is the big elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet, and in my opinion, it is the Holy Grail, because if we can get the DAO question right, we can move the entire space forward. And the biggest problem there is, what is the objective function that it's going to underpin DAO governance? You know, when you're looking at this, it has to be positively correlated with social innovation and technological innovation. It has to be anti-correlated with existential risk. And it has to be measurable in a way that measuring that objective function itself doesn't devalue into some political tribalism, okay? So bringing that, and then you look at, for example, what the neoliberal system of governance has been, it's been one where you have various inputs that are all approximately optimized in different ways, but somewhat correlated towards human happiness, and then you pit them against each other in a system of checks and balances, and then you hope that when they fail in ways that are themselves anti-correlated, sort of like a Swiss cheese model, okay? And then you let social and cultural evolution take care of the rest. So how do you make that make sense in something like a DAO? And the easy question is that you don't. You don't, because the way that agents interact and the way that they are identified in decentralized systems is entirely different than the way that we're used to. And then you run into a problem where if you don't identify these agents, and for example, if you just use something like coin voting, then you move to a system where you have either completely disincentivized the formation of public goods or you're overly subsidizing plutocracy. And neither of those are good. So what we've tried to do in Europe, and what kudos to the regulators, is that number one, they've decided that at least on the question of what is a security, we've agreed that, okay, what is in MiCA does not apply to MiFID. And that's important because, at least for now, we're not getting into the debate over whether a receipt token from liquid staking is going to fall under a commodities law analysis or under a legals law analysis. So am I going to use the Reeves test or the Howey test, or am I going to use a commodity laws analysis? We've created a system where you can issue asset reference tokens, so stable coins, or you can issue e-money tokens that are broadly defined as e-money tokens under the e-money directive. And then we have a system where we can license crypto asset service providers and exchanges. What I think is important also is we need to address the issue around self-hosted wallets and identities more, in that we are approaching an economy, and kudos to the Emirates because they're leading in this regard, where the machine is a consumer. So not just you and I and natural legal persons, but the machine itself will consume, will have a self-hosted wallet, will be able to trigger payments. So unless you have an attestation framework where that machine has agency to trigger payments and that machine has agency to act on its legal behalf, you are completely missing the IoT revolution and you will be left in the dust. And that is just a fact of the matter. What we have done in Europe that is also important is we have the AIDAS framework, which opens the door towards using, for example, zero-knowledge proofs in the context of self-sovereign identity, which you could argue is also a necessary prerequisite for the establishment of these machine identities. So listen, Europe lost the cloud race. We don't have the largest market share. We don't have the world's reserve currency by virtue of terms of trade. So for us, identity is Europe's story to tell. And I think that that is the framework where we are kind of settling, and how to create the industrial applications for the token economy that are going to power us into the next decade. But there's extreme competition coming from the APAC region, from the Middle East, and I think that that's good because you can't just have one region and say, well, this is our race to lose. I think that everybody has to play an active role. And I would say that decentralized finance in general is going to pose a challenge to regulators, specifically because you run into an issue, and you can attest to this. For example, if I can take like a Uniswap, and I can say, well, okay, this is the interface layer of Uniswap, and this is the smart contract that handles the actual exchange. Okay, well, how do I regulate the interface layer versus, and how do I make that make sense with what happens on the exchange? And gatekeeper regulation would argue that somebody somewhere had to press a button, and then if you come to the point where you're regulating the person that presses the button, ontologically, you could say that, well, we need to regulate the developers. But then if you regulate the developers, you also open up a can of worms that is itself problematic. So you see this becomes a feedback loop where we always keep running back to the first principle of the thing.
Wonderful. Jason, go ahead.
If I could just jump in on that, I find it so fascinating. So what you're touching on is what I would consider the principal challenge for digital asset regulation and like the Holy Grail, if it can be solved, right? Which is to say that we are going to increasingly have smart contracts, other things we interact with that don't have an intermediary, right? So the entire financial system, from a regulatory perspective, is premised on the idea that there is somewhere in the mix an intermediary who's taking your personal information, who's managing a ledger. So in the digital asset space, this goes away. And I think for me, this has been the primary legal challenge, is how do we move forward without that intermediary? And I think what you're alluding to with identity, right, this is actually like the value unlock for the entire ecosystem, right? So if we can do identity on chain, for example, in a way that's consistent with privacy, and if we can create permissioning ability, right, so that people can move through an ecosystem seamlessly, but also meeting the public policy goals of anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing, et cetera, right? So this is a huge value add, and this is a huge value add for Web3. It's not just about DAOs or DeFi. At Fireblocks, we actually launched a really interesting experiment in this, working with Aave. So one of the ways of thinking about this is, as you said, to have a gatekeeper. So at Fireblocks, we were doing KYC on institutional customers, and you could only get into this ring-fenced DeFi protocol if you had gone through this process, right? So it wasn't publicly available, and you had to pass through a gatekeeper. Singapore is experimenting with this a lot. This is one way of thinking about it. But I think even more promising is that we're going to see technology solutions for this, and I think those are going to come along pretty rapidly.
If I could just add one point, it's also really important to think about, like, when you're looking at, like, we talk about decentralization, like it's this big kind of ephemeral thing, but in reality, it's difficult to say exactly what you mean. For example, like, if I'm looking at it like a civil law is architecturally centralized in that, you know, it comes down from the top courts, but common law is architecturally decentralized in that it's based on precedent from a bunch of smaller courts, right? And then if I look at a smart contract protocol, it is both architecturally centralized and it is logically centralized in the sense that it's based on the single source of truth that underpins the consensus mechanism. And the difference between a smart contract and, let's say, civil law and common law is that those two are themselves also politically centralized, and at the end of the day, the rule of law is the rule of law, and that comes down as an edict from the top. So you have a system of top-down governance and a system of bottom-up governance, and the smart contract, it sits somewhere in between full legal recognition and full interoperability, and it's on a grading scale that oscillates between those 2 points. That's the way that I try to think about the smart contract.
This is actually a wonderful metaphor, and it's a wonderful conversation, because I would argue that the entire malaise that we have vis-a-vis this blockchain and this new emerging economy is this concept of decentralization. And what you said, ERWIN, about the big elephant in the room, it is actually the big elephant in the room, which is decentralization. We grew up, all our systems, like you mentioned, SAQR, has been developed on a centralized approach.
Right.
So you can't have a centralized approach thinking and decentralized applications. That does not work. So it's either you buy into the decentralization, the philosophy of decentralization, with all its perks and with all its consequences, or you say, no, I will not have decentralization, I will keep going with CeFi and all that. So this contentious conversation, it is actually signaling a form of a new era and a new time for humanity, which is building on decentralized solutions. And that is the malaise that we have as regulators, as academicians, as experts, as thought leaders. How can we, again, combine this decentralization movement that is technology-led movement with those institutions that believe in centralization? So that's the major philosophical issue that we need to...
And it is a philosophical conversation. When
Yes.
you talk about centralization versus decentralization, it's not a technology conversation,
Yes.
it's a philosophical conversation. It's one thing that we could argue here for the next year or so.
Yeah.
Having said that, let's be real in what we're doing as well. Let's do a stock take. Have we achieved decentralization anywhere? My argument would be, other than Bitcoin, and I'm not a maximalist, mind you, other than Bitcoin, unfortunately, full decentralization, and even if you go to Bitcoin, you can then make the argument that, hey, 5% of all wallets hold 95% of all coins in circulation. Is it really decentralized? But see, these notions were non-existent in technology only 13 years ago. So it's okay. We're just figuring this out. Right? If we're looking at this as a year, then today we are in the first second of the first minute of the first hour of the first day of the first month in the first year of technology adoption. How long have we adopted technology for? 50 years? 60 years? Right? This entire crypto and blockchain conversation, non-existent before 2008. Well, the theory around it goes back to the 70s, but for all intents and purposes, really, practically, we've only seen this since 2008. So, mind you, it's okay not to have the answer. But it's very important to accept that while we are arriving at that answer, there isn't one particular model that works or doesn't work. And you know what, I'd be lying if I'd tell you here, and actually I'd go even further, I say anyone is lying if they know what will happen 10 years from now, just from a governance point of view. All that we know is that for now, for the first time in technology history, we have a way to go towards decentralization. We have leading examples that have used decentralization in a way that is completely decentralized from the bottom up. Having said that, if we want to understand this space, let's look at another technology that came up with this notion of decentralization, and it's the internet, right? Just by a show of hands, how many people can explain the internet to me? Right. In a room of 300-400 people, just 3 hands went up. With that, the conversation needs to quickly switch from what is the technology behind it to what and how can we use it. Because we're all users of the internet and none of us understand it for all intents and purposes. And even in an internet world where everything is available publicly, many of us still use intranets in one way or the other, right? So in this world where the internet is widely adopted, there is still a part of the internet that is reserved for certain people of a certain organization. And my best notion is that we will never be at a completely decentralized world. Some elements will be decentralized, but some elements will forever be in one way or the other centralized.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Thank you, SAQR, for putting this background. And I agree with you that we are starting this revolution and you cannot expect it. And you don't have to rush it. You don't have to expect. So that leads me to my final question. And I'll give you only maybe a minute per speaker. What would be the contour of a good regulation? If you are a regulator, if you are in the governance body of an industry, what would you like to see in any regulation that will promote decentralization, but at the same time tells people it is okay to start this journey, don't rush it, because if you rush it, you may actually pay price. So briefly, SAQR, what would be 3 things that you need to think about, or 2 things that you need to think about that would be the hallmark of this good regulation?
I think the first element is accept the unknown, right? Accept the fact that no one's figured it out just yet, right? And I want to take the example of the DIFC, and not only because my brother Mohammed Belushi is sitting in front of me, take a sandbox approach, right? Tell technology companies, you are welcome over here. You can try stuff out. And you know what? We'll figure it out together because many of the questions that we need to ask haven't even been posed just yet, right? So accept the unknown, take a sandbox approach, and have the regulator working with the private sector. And you know why I believe the UAE is so successful in that, because they do exactly that.
Very good. Thank you so much. Jason, what's your 1 or 2, 3 conditions for good regulation?
Yeah, to be honest, we don't take a prescriptive approach, right? So we spend a lot of time talking to regulators, and we spend a lot of time talking to policymakers, and the message is basically we're not going to haggle with them over this rule or that rule or that rule. We just come and say, listen, we need sensible regulation, talk to the industry, and we need clear rules of the road for adoption. So we're just basically looking for clarity. We believe, sure, that rules can be better or worse, but at the end of the day, we believe that most institutional customers, once they have clarity, they will find a way to adapt. I just want to end on a note picking up on your question about the internet, because I actually think the fact that most people don't know how the internet works is actually where we want to end up.
Right.
And
Exactly.
And because the conversations I have about regulation with policymakers, the feedback I've been getting is, stop talking about the tech.
Right.
Just stop talking about the tech. Talk to us about use cases. Talk to us about utility. Talk to us about what it does and how it changes lives. So, I actually hope with blockchain we can get to a place where people are using it and they don't have to say the words blockchain or decentralized.
Yes, and that's where we need to start. Start with the application, make
Exactly.
it easy. Erwin, you have the last word, only about 10 seconds left.
So as an anecdote, so I participated in a working group called Tokenized Europe recently that was launched by the European Commission and the German Banking Association, and one of the findings from this working group that had a bunch of commercial banks and Web3 startups in it was essentially that if you talk about tech to Joe and Jane public, they're probably not going to care. However, education is important. So how do we educate the public and make them excited about using this technology that's going to ultimately upend the way that they live their lives without boring them to death on the technical idiosyncrasies, which all of us find super interesting, but the people on the street honestly don't care about? And I don't think that anybody has an answer to that yet. And the other thing that I want to say is that it is never a good starting point when you're looking at something that is brand new and saying, what we had before is going to work identically, and we're going to try to put a square peg into a round hole. Because you're always going to have negative externalities, and you're going to have capital flight, you're going to have brain drain, and this is what we're seeing globally. And the jurisdictions that manage to balance through regulatory sandboxes, for example, a welcoming presence for those startups are going to be the ones that will capitalize on that per capita value in the future. And the ones that don't will be left behind.
Wonderful. I think the final thought that I am getting from you is that you cannot expect clarity in an ambiguous world.
Right.
You cannot expect definitions in a technology that itself is moving fast. So what is good actually is to have this kind of conversation, and that's why I love Dubai, I love the UAE, I love TrustCon and all the investors and all the sponsors, because they allow you to have this type of conversations. Tech people, non-tech people, commercial people, private people, all these people coming together to figure out together what will be good for this technology. Thank you so much,
Thank you very much
and
for
thank
having
you so
us.
much.